The light in the kitchen was on when Paige Whitfield pulled into the driveway at 8:47 p.m., which should have meant nothing. She'd been on the road since before dawn. The supplier meeting in Charlotte had collapsed before lunch. 23 words in an email, no apology, and she'd spent the whole 2-hour drive home telling herself it was fine, that she'd rebook, that being home a night early might actually be good for once. She could help Grant with Gracie's bath. She could sleep in her own bed instead of the Holiday Inn on Route 21, with its thin walls, and the couple in room 214 who argued until midnight. She noticed Kendall's white Jeep in the driveway before she noticed anything else. The cracked side mirror caught the porch light the way it always did, like a wink. Paige had been telling Kendall to fix that mirror for 7 months. Her first thought was actually warm. Kendall had come over to keep Grant company. That was the kind of thing Kendall did. Showed up with wine and takeout and very loud opinions about reality TV, and Grant pretended to be annoyed and then stayed up until midnight watching it with her anyway. 12 years of exactly this kind of ordinary. Paige let herself in through the side door because she always did. She heard it before she understood it, and then she understood it, and then there were about 4 seconds where the understanding and her body were not in agreement about what to do next. Her daughter was asleep upstairs. That was the only thought that existed in those 4 seconds. Not the sound, not the specific geography of what was happening in her house. Just Gracie, 4 years old, asleep in the room at the end of the hall with the nightlight shaped like a moon. The absolute, non-negotiable fact that she would not wake up to this. Paige set her bag on the kitchen counter without a sound. She opened the refrigerator. There was leftover pasta in a blue container, which meant Grant had cooked, which meant the evening had started normally enough. Gracie's lunch for tomorrow wasn't packed yet, which meant Paige would do it now. She pulled out the container of apple slices she'd prepped Sunday, the cheese cubes, the wheat crackers. Gracie had recently decided were her favorite in the whole world. She assembled the lunchbox with the careful attention of someone diffusing something. Every click of the container lid felt very loud. Grant came out about 6 minutes later. He was barefoot. His shirt was inside out. He looked like a man who had rehearsed something on the walk down the hallway and then lost all of it the moment he turned the corner and saw her standing at the kitchen counter, pressing a butterfly pick into a 4-year-old's lunchbox. Paige. His voice had a quality she'd never heard from him before, something that had completely run out of cover. She didn't look up. She set the lunchbox in the refrigerator and closed the door. "I need you to not wake her up," she said. Not loud, not quiet. Exactly the volume of a sentence that means exactly what it says. "That's the only thing I need from you right now." He said her name again. "I heard you the first time." Kendall appeared in the kitchen doorway 30 seconds later. She'd wrapped herself in the gray blanket off the couch. The one Gracie called her cozy, like it was hers to take. Something about that detail landed in Paige with a specific weight she couldn't name. Not the betrayal, which she'd already filed somewhere cold and functional. The blanket, the casual ownership of reaching for the nearest soft thing. "Paige, please just don't." Paige rinsed her hands at the sink, dried them on the dish towel, rehung it on the oven handle. "There's nothing you can start that sentence with that I want to hear finished." Kendall's face did something complicated. Paige watched it with the slight remove of a person who had decided, somewhere between the refrigerator and the sink, that she was not going to perform this. Not tonight. Not in this kitchen. Not where her daughter might come downstairs for a glass of water and walk into the worst version of every person she'd loved best. "I want you both out of this house before 6 a.m., Paige said. "Gracie wakes up at 6:15. I need this to look like a normal morning." Grant stepped toward her. "We should talk. We can fix this." "You keep using that word." She looked at him then, really looked at him, the way you look at something you've been carrying a long time and are only now seeing clearly in daylight. Fix. Like there was a malfunction. Like this was some kind of error and not something you chose to do, in our house, in our bed, with someone who has been sitting at our Thanksgiving table for a decade. He flinched. You made a choice, she said, more than once by the look of you. Own that. At least own that. She picked up her bag. She went upstairs. She checked on Gracie first. Wild red curls pressed flat on one side from sleep, one arm thrown over the stuffed elephant she'd named Peanut at age 2 and never once reconsidered. Paige stood in the doorway longer than she needed to. She breathed. Then she went to the guest room, because she was not sleeping in that bedroom tonight, and she sat on the edge of the bed in the dark and did not cry. The option was right there, adjacent like a door she could open. She didn't open it. She opened her phone instead. There was an email she'd been ignoring for 3 weeks, a message from Marian Reyes, the chef who'd taken a chance on her 12 years ago when she was 20, and convinced she could run a professional kitchen and had absolutely no idea what she was doing. Marian had built 3 restaurants in Portland, Oregon, before she was 50. She'd reached out because she was opening a 4th, a café bakery concept, and she wanted Paige in as a partner and head baker. The offer had been sitting in her inbox like something she was afraid to want. Paige read it again in the dark of the guest room. Then she replied. She was thorough in the days that followed. She made lists. She worked through them. She told Grant on the 3rd morning, quietly, in the kitchen while Gracie was at preschool, that she was leaving, not leaving to think, actually leaving. He stood very still. You can't take Gracie across the country. We'll talk to a mediator about the arrangement. I'm telling you what's happening. Paige, I can fix this. That word again. She picked up her coffee. What you did wasn't a malfunction, Grant. It was a choice. You chose. She chose in this house. I need you to stop asking me to explain why that changes things. She called Kendall exactly once the morning before she left. Not to talk. She needed to say one thing in her actual voice, not in a text where it could be read in any tone Kendall chose. I'm not going to tell you what I think of you, Paige said when Kendall answered. You already know. I'm calling so you hear me clearly. I'm done. Not taking space, done. Not angry for now, done. Finished. Don't call my daughter. Don't send cards. Don't tell mutual friends you're sorry and hope it reaches me. Kendall made a sound. I'm hanging up now, Paige said, and she did. Portland didn't care about Paige Whitfield's marriage or her best friend or the specific sequence of choices that had dismantled 12 years of her life in a single evening. That was one of the things she hadn't anticipated, how thoroughly a new city could be indifferent to the things that felt, from the inside, like they should be visible on her face. Marian gave her the keys to the kitchen 2 days after she arrived. The space was a former print shop near the Pearl District, exposed brick, industrial windows, and the ghost smell of old ink that never fully left no matter how many times they cleaned. Paige stood in the middle of it on the first morning and thought, I can make something here. She put Gracie in a Montessori program 3 blocks away. Gracie, who was adaptable in the way of children who haven't yet learned that change is supposed to be frightening, announced on day 2 that her new teacher's name was Miss Pryor, and there was a classroom fish named Gerald. Paige laughed for the first time in 3 weeks. The grief came anyway. It always does, eventually, not as the wave she'd been bracing for, but as something ambient. She'd be scoring pastry dough at 5 in the morning, and she'd think, without warning, about the way Grant used to bring her coffee before she was fully awake. The specific ritual of a life. The small habits you build with someone over years turn out to be the hardest part to put down. She put them down. Every time she put them down, that was the practice. The cafe opened on a Tuesday in March. She named it Tin Sparrow, a name she'd been holding in her head for years before she had the right place for it. The food press came because of Marian's reputation. They stayed because of Paige's biscuits, which a writer for a regional magazine later described as the kind of thing that makes you feel like someone understood something about you. She did not read that line without feeling a complicated mixture of pride and something that still had a small bruise in it. She was 40 days into being open when she met Seth. He came in on a gray Wednesday, sat at the counter with a laptop, ordered black coffee and a ham and Gruyere croissant, and worked for 2 hours without bothering anyone. Paige noticed him the way she noticed most things. Cataloged, filed, moved on. He came back Thursday. He came back Friday. On Friday, he asked if the sourdough starter was her own. She said yes. He said he'd thought so. There was a depth to it that most commercial starters couldn't replicate, something time-specific, particular to a single kitchen's environment. She looked at him. Are you a food writer? Restaurant critic, mostly. He named the publication. She knew it. Are you reviewing us? Not today. She considered that. Then why are you here? He had the expression of someone deciding whether to be honest or deflective. He chose honest because the croissant was excellent, and I like working in spaces where it's obvious someone cares about what they're doing. She went back to the kitchen. She thought about that answer for the rest of the day, which told her something about the state of her capacity for being seen. Seth remained. He was not pushy about it. He never performed his patience the way some men did, like a virtue being demonstrated for credit. He asked questions when she seemed open and didn't when she wasn't. He was wrong sometimes and said so without a whole production about it. He had a dry humor that occasionally made her laugh when she'd been awake since 4, and had flour in her hair and was running on her 3rd coffee. She did not trust him quickly. She trusted the way she made bread now, slowly, with attention to the variables, checking conditions before committing to anything. The call she hadn't prepared for came on a Thursday morning, 9 months after opening. She was restocking the pastry case when her phone showed a number she didn't recognize. She answered because she was expecting a supplier. It was Kendall. The silence afterward was long enough that Paige checked her screen to make sure the call was still connected. I needed to tell you something, Kendall said. Her voice had a texture to it Paige couldn't immediately place. I needed you to hear it from me. Grant and I stopped, a few months after you left. A breath. I know that doesn't change anything for you. I know that. I needed you to know I'm sorry. Paige stood very still next to the pastry case. Outside, the street was doing what streets do at 9 in the morning. Ordinary, indifferent, continuous. I hear you, she said finally. I believe you're sorry. She set down the tray she'd been holding. That doesn't mean I want to have this conversation or any conversation with you. I told you clearly when I left. Paige. Don't call this number again. She ended the call, stood with her hand on the counter. There was the faint tremor she always got when something reached further into her than intended. She noticed it, put the phone in her pocket, finished restocking the pastry case, opened the front door at exactly 7 a.m., the way she always did. She told Seth 3 weeks later, mid-sentence in a different conversation, the way things surface when you've been carrying them. He listened without interrupting. She apologized, Paige said, and I believe her, but it made it real again somehow. The way things stop being real after a while and then something brings it back. Yeah, Seth said, that happens. She waited for the follow-up, the gentle probe, the are you processing, the have you considered. It didn't come. I don't know if I'm done being angry, she said. You don't have to be, he said, not on anyone else's schedule. That was all, and somehow it was the exact right amount. The trouble came 6 weeks later, from a direction she hadn't thought to watch. Marion had been quietly building toward a James Beard nomination, and the food press attention had been growing steadily. Paige had kept her head down and done the work, and tried not to think too hard about what recognition at that level might mean. Then she found the post. It appeared in a professional food industry forum she monitored. The account was 3 weeks old. The language was careful, framed as questions, calibrated to sound like concern rather than accusation. Isn't it worth noting that the Tin Sparrow's signature sourdough bears a striking resemblance to the method developed at the White Elm, where the owner staged in 2014, just asking for transparency? She read it twice. Then she sat in her office at the back of the cafe and thought, very clearly, about who knew she'd staged at the White Elm, who knew the specific timing, who had enough knowledge of her culinary history to frame something this precisely. The level of detail was not coincidence. She called Marion. Marion had already seen it. They talked for 40 minutes. Paige spent that night pulling documentation, recipe development notebooks from 2012, time-stamped, correspondence with her stage supervisor, who had written in her reference letter that Paige's sourdough work was original and predated her time at the restaurant. Independent records from her flour supplier dating back to 2013. She built the record the way she built everything, methodically, without gaps, leaving nothing open to interpretation. She found the connection on a Sunday afternoon, not by looking for it directly, but because the part of her brain that worked on problems quietly in the background had been turning it over for weeks, and finally had something to report. The forum account that had first posted the rumor was created 11 days before the Beard nomination inquiry. 11 days. And Kendall had known about the nomination. Paige's cousin had mentioned it in a group text that Kendall was still part of, back when the world had been different and Paige hadn't thought to remove her. The timing wasn't coincidence. The specificity of the culinary language wasn't coincidence. She sat in her office and looked at the wall. The apology had been real, maybe, or it had been something else, something that looked like remorse from one angle and reconnaissance from another. Maybe both, which was the version that was hardest to hold. It meant Kendall was more complicated than villain, more complicated than victim, and there was no clean place to put that. She didn't try. She just had the evidence, and she had the knowledge, sitting cold in her chest, that the woman who had held Gracie the day she came home from the hospital had taken what she knew and tried to use it to destroy the thing Paige had built from the wreckage of the worst morning of her life. She called Marion, then the food industry attorney Marion recommended, then Seth. "Can you come over?" she said. "I need to think out loud." "Already on my way." He came. She laid everything on the kitchen table, the post, the timeline, the documentation, the logic connecting all of it. He read through it in the order she'd placed it, without rushing, turning each page with the deliberateness of someone who understands that what they're being shown matters to the person showing it. When he looked up, he said, "She planned this." "Yes." "What do you need right now, practically?" "I need the attorney to move. I need Marion to make a statement. I need this documented before it gets any further." She pressed her fingers against the table's edge. "And I need." She stopped. What she'd been about to say, I need to have been smarter than to soften, even in the private ways she never saw. She recognized the sentence as the beginning of a spiral that would cost her days she didn't have. She stopped it. "I need this to be finished," she said instead. Seth put his hand on the table, not on her hand, not reaching toward her, just placing it there, available. She looked at it. She put her hand over his. "It will be," he said. She wasn't fully there yet, but the wanting to believe him was real, and the hand under hers was warm, and that was enough to keep moving. The documentation went live on a Monday. Marion released a formal statement. The food attorney had coordinated with the forum administrators. Within 24 hours, the original post was removed, the account suspended, and 3 major food writers had published pieces citing Paige's full culinary record, dated, documented, irrefutable. The White Elm's former head chef released his own statement, unsolicited. He wrote that Paige's sourdough methodology had been entirely original during her stage, and that her starter development predated her time there by 2 years, which he could confirm from their correspondence. She read that standing in her kitchen before Gracie woke up. She read it twice. Then she put her phone in her pocket and stood in the early morning quiet for a moment, doing something she hadn't done in 2 weeks. Nothing. Just existing in a space that wasn't demanding something from her. Grant called the day the story broke publicly. She answered, which surprised even her. "I saw what happened," he said. "Most people have." A pause. When Marion announced the nomination, I called Kendall. "I told her because I was proud of you, and I wanted to tell someone who knew you." He exhaled. I gave her the information. I didn't know what she'd do with it. But that doesn't make it not my fault. Silence. Thank you for telling me, she said. That's it? What else would you like? A long pause. Nothing, I just needed you to know. She stood at her kitchen window and looked at nothing in particular. She thought about the person she'd been 5 years ago, who had believed that the life she had was the life she was supposed to want. She could find that person in her memory clearly. She could not find her in her body anywhere. I hope you're doing okay, she said. And she meant it, in the distant way you mean things about people who have moved entirely outside the radius of your concern. She hung up. Then she texted Seth, "Waffles. Come over if you want." He arrived with orange juice and the Saturday paper, which nobody under 60 actually read, but which Seth bought every week with the affectionate commitment of someone performing a small cultural ritual he decided to keep regardless of its practicality. Gracie looked at him from across the kitchen table with the frank appraisal of a 4-year-old. "Do you like waffles?" she asked. "Very much," Seth said. Gracie considered this. "Mama makes the best ones," she said, as if he should be aware of this fact before proceeding further. "I've heard," Seth said, which was technically true. Gracie appeared satisfied. She returned to her strawberries. Paige caught Seth's eye over the table and felt something she had spent a year telling herself she wasn't ready for. Not lightning, not epiphany, but something smaller and more real. Something like standing in a room that had been opened after a long winter. Not warm yet, but not held closed anymore either. She passed him the syrup. Later, after Gracie had gone to play and the dishes were done, Seth stood at the sink beside her, drying a bowl she'd just washed. "You okay?" he asked. She thought about the question honestly, the way she'd learned to think about honest questions, without reflexively reaching for the easier answer. "I think so," she said. "For the first time in a while, I think I actually am." He handed her the bowl. She put it away. Outside, the street was ordinary and alive, completely indifferent to the fact that something had just finished inside her that had been going on for a very long time. She had built a kitchen from scratch in a city that didn't know her name. She had raised a daughter who was currently somewhere in the apartment singing to a stuffed elephant named Peanut. She had documented her own credibility with her own hands and made it structurally impossible to dispute. And she had slowly, carefully, with all the same attention she gave to bread that required time, let someone in. Not because the fear was gone, it wasn't, but because she'd made her peace with the fact that fear and trust are not opposites. They are just the cost of caring about anything worth having. She closed the cabinet. She went to find her daughter. And the story of the worst evening of her life sat inside her. Not ahead of her, not behind her, not something she was still running from, just part of what she was made of now. Evidence of something survived and rebuilt. A starter, she thought, which by definition contains everything that came before it and makes the next thing possible. You fed it every day. You kept the conditions right. You paid attention. That was the whole secret, and it had been the secret all along.